Hi, I'm Dr. T, and this episode is entitled, How Do We Decide Something is a Problem for Society? It's a very important question, and this really gets at a perspective that sociologists refer to as the social construction of reality. Sounds kind of complex. It's actually a very simple idea. It just means that reality is something that we all agree to believe. That's it. We just decide this is true and that is not true. Now, you might say, okay, well, we do that in the social world, but certainly not for the physical world. Not so fast. So I'm old enough to remember when we had 9 planets in the solar system. And that ninth planet, way out on the edge, was Pluto. And then 10, 15 years ago, we decided that Pluto was no longer a planet. Nothing changed about Pluto. There was nothing that happened that made Pluto somehow different than it was before. It simply was a congress of scientists who took a vote and said, do we still think Pluto is a planet? Do we not? And they've literally voted Pluto off the island. Now there's been some talk about bringing Pluto back in and saying, okay, we do have 9 planets again in the solar system. That's what we mean by the social construction of reality. We just all decide that these things are true. The ultimate example of this perspective is what parents do for children all the time. I was sitting one time and with a friend, and our children were outside, and one of them, her 9-year-old, came in and said, Mom, do we believe in God? And she said, yes, we do. And he said, okay. And he went running back outside. Not, what's the evidence for or against God? What's the theology? Just, do we believe in God? And the parent said yes. I did this once for my daughter back in the 2000 election. We were the lone Democratic family on a street of Republicans. So there are all these Bush signs, George W. Bush, in people's yards. And my daughter was fighting with one of the neighbor kids, and she came in one day after school. She was only, 12 years old, and said, Mom, are we Democrats or Republicans? And I said, Sweetie, we're Democrats. And she said, okay. And she went back out on that bus and defended Al Gore to the death. Didn't know what a Democrat or Republican was, didn't know the difference between them. Just, this is who we are. This is who I've been told we are. And so I'm in. I am all in. Now, when we talk about social problems and do we agree that something is a problem, some things are a problem for everyone. Pollution, for example. There really isn't enough money in the world to buy you relief from polluted water, polluted air, polluted land. Maybe you can move around and try to get a little bit away from it, but eventually it catches up with everybody. Some things are not problems for everyone. For example, poverty, right? There's a certain percentage of our society that lives below what we call the poverty line. Now, those of us who are not in that group might still be affected in other ways. For example, the tax dollars that we contribute may be used to help support people who are living in poverty. We might be afraid of going in places where that are poorer areas because we are afraid that there might be more crime there. So there are still ways in which we might be affected, even if it's not directly. But when we talk about something being a problem, I want you to ask yourself 2 questions. The first question is, for whom is this a problem, right? Everyone, a certain amount of people, are we all affected indirectly? And perhaps more importantly, who decided that this was a problem? And this is important because there is power in defining problems, pointing to something as a problem. I'll give you an example. Many of us would agree that we live in a society that has a high level of violence. And when we talk about this, we are usually concerned about what we call interpersonal violence, robbery, murder, rape, violence from between intimate partners or from parent to child, what we call family violence. These are all examples of interpersonal violence. And some people are very much harmed by them, even killed by interpersonal violence. But more people are harmed by what we would call structural violence. Now, this refers to the violence or the harm that's done to people through the everyday workings of our society. So structural violence would include things like pollution and all the diseases and deaths that pollution causes. It would include deaths that occur in unsafe workplaces. There have been tragic circumstances where people have died in fires, for example, because exit doors have been locked and people were not able to get out. There are deaths and disease caused by lack of access to healthcare or lack of access to good healthcare or timely healthcare. And then, of course, war is the ultimate form of structural violence. So there are lots of things that actually harm people at a much higher rate than the interpersonal violence, but we don't talk about the structural violence. Our attention is focused on the interpersonal violence. Why? Well, because people who have platforms or megaphones to shout loudly have told us that these are problems. Politicians do this all the time. Crime is a very easy thing to run on. Making people feel like they are not safe is a very easy thing for politicians to be against. And so they whip up people's fear of crime to get people to vote for them to solve this problem of crime. News outlets choose to report on crimes. And oftentimes they will do things like say crime is up. Well, they'll pick and choose their comparison points to make it look like crime has increased more than it has because it gets people's attention. They will tune into the television show. They will look at the newspaper, click on the link, etc. Social media, influencers on social media are able to convince us that crime is a problem or that there are other problems that we should be concerned about. Leaders of industry, heads of corporations, leaders of social movements, anybody who has the capacity to speak to a larger audience and to speak about something that people can connect with can convince us that there is a problem of some sort that needs to be addressed. So if we go back to this difference between interpersonal violence and structural violence, we ask the question, who benefits from us thinking about violence in this way? Well, one thing that is a benefit is that if we're focused on interpersonal violence, as opposed to the violence that occurs in the way work is organized and society in general operates, that means that we're not kicking up a fuss about all the ways that we are being harmed and killed unnecessarily because, let's say, workplaces are not regulated appropriately for safety. So that benefits people who run these workplaces because then they don't have to do as much to make sure that their workplaces are safe. The other reason we need to ask these questions, for whom are these a problem and who benefits by thinking about these problems in this way, is that the way we think about a problem shapes the solutions that we come up with. And we are going to see this as we move through future episodes. We're going to see that the way we think about a problem shapes what we do about it. So right now, when we focus on interpersonal violence, we do things like sending all kinds of police into particularly poorer communities and communities of color. We build prisons to put people in instead of taxing or regulating businesses and making sure that they're operating in ways that don't pollute our air, our water, our land, that don't engage in practices that make it unsafe or risky in the workplace for their workers. So it's very, very important to pay attention to these problems and how they are shaped, how they are framed, or how this perspective I started would say how they are constructed. The social construction of reality is a very powerful perspective. Once you start applying it, you will never look at the world in the same way. You'll start asking these questions. Why did we decide that this was an issue? Why did we decide to do things this way? Who benefits from our having made those choices? Try it out and see what you think.